This is one of my longest projects yet, but if after this you still want more, you can get a bunch of fully produced exclusive videos over at patreon.com/writingongames. Thanks, and now on with the show. Well, it's my first upload in a few months, and there sure are plenty of incredible titles releasing in droves at the moment to make a bunch of nice, timely videos about. Or I could instead spend all this time making a feature-length presentation on a specific aspect of a series going back decades. I think we all know what the obvious answer is here. If you were to think of the elements that make up a good action game, I'm willing to bet that bosses would rank pretty high up there, a real number 3 or 4 on the list of Family Fortune's answers. You know, after working your way through minion-level foes, you're presented with a climactic set piece, a one-on-one duel that serves as a final exam of sorts, testing you on the mechanics and systems you've been interacting with up to that point. And yet, for such a crucial component of these kinds of games, such bosses that end up becoming truly iconic for their series are something of a rare breed. I'm not simply talking about boss battles that happen to be fun or uniquely challenging here. I'm talking the kinds of encounters and characters that when you picture the game or series, you picture them, so etched onto the identity of the wider package that they become the identity of that game to a certain extent. But in that regard, it's difficult to think of a series with quite so many of those legitimate icons as Metal Gear Solid. Aided in no small part by character designs from Yoji Shinkawa that define sleek. When I think of bosses in games, my mind immediately shifts to the various ragtag groups of unhinged individuals scheming or revolting or defecting or whatever else. Psycho Mantis, Grey Fox, Revolver Ocelot, Liquid Snake, Vamp, Olga, the Boss, Revolver Ocelot again, or any one of the towering mechanical behemoths Solid Snake and his various predecessors are tasked with bringing down to size single-handedly. The list goes on and on and on. These are characters, encounters that intertwine mechanics and story in a manner that few games do, that in many ways have come to shape how we think about bosses, mechanics, hell, even basic control in video games as a medium, as a means of telling stories. But with a series that has endured as long as MGS, as many icons as it has generated over the decades, there are bound to be some clunkers among them too, even in otherwise fantastic games. In fact, playing through the series again recently, it was interesting to consider how the varying quality of certain bosses lined up with the overall design principles of their respective games, shifting standards of play at the time generally, and especially later on, the increasingly and publicly tumultuous production of said games. In fact, I'd say I found myself surprised on this recent playthrough as to just which boss rosters and games ended up resonating most with me this time around, and which bosses maybe don't quite hold up to such intense scrutiny. All this to say, Metal Gear Solid is a series you can very much track the highs and lows of directly through its boss design. And so I decided that in the same vein as, say, one of my Hitman analysis videos, and I should say through the lens of the game's normal difficulty, I know there are some that swear by European extreme, and that's totally cool, but I just wanted to talk about them in terms of the experience that most players are going to have. It might be fun to examine the various encounters of one of my all-time favourite game series in closer detail, and at least attempt to map a trajectory over the years of the franchise's evolving strengths and weaknesses in that regard, trying to develop a better understanding of why these iconic characters have stuck so thoroughly within our collective memory over the years. And when it comes to the bosses of that 1998 original, time can certainly be an odd thing. See, I'm not sure whether it's just the decades I've spent acclimatizing to the ridiculousness of this series, but there's something about FOXHOUND and the mavericks and misfits that comprise it that, in my head, seems to bypass at least some of the cartoonish absurdity one should probably associate with such a roster. Indeed, it might simply be the move to 3D, with these fully voiced characters being played totally straight, more thoroughly weaved into the grand militaristic machinations of the game's wider plot as they are, that might make you forget that these villains are drawing super hard from not only the schlockier vibes of certain movies, but the MSX games that came previously. You know, there's not some great aesthetic leap between the Russian gunslinging cowboy, the competitive muck-tuck eater with a Gatling gun, and characters like the Machine Gun Kid and Jungle Evil. The kinds of caricatures whose tangibly pixely, cartoonish nature should become more prevalent with an increase in graphical fidelity when you get a more detailed look at them. And yet, at least for me, that FOXHOUND has so endured in the memories of players as part of the great pantheon of characters in video games is testament to the fact that such silliness, while certainly present and welcome, is far from their defining quality. That, much like their more over-the-top character traits balance out the often heavier themes they represent, their respective battles reflect a delicate equilibrium between gameplay and narrative, each serving each other in a way that goes against the reputation that Metal Gear Solid developed. That 1998 original was somehow the clunky one of the bunch relative to its more fluid sequels, that this was a series you watched rather than played. All this to say, Metal Gear Solid is the video game equivalent of a Hollywood action blockbuster, but in a way that goes beyond its obvious visual cinematic influences. The arcadey, distinctly video game quality of its predecessor's villains carries over, and as a result, while these characters might wax philosophical about the nature of war and conflict, the rather frantic pacing of that PS1 game remains something to behold. Even accounting for the backtracking you're forced to do, and not accounting for cutscenes and codec calls, in terms of pure gameplay, it is consistently refreshing to see the breakneck speed at which the original whisks you between encounters that are all delightfully bespoke, both mechanically and narratively. You absolutely barrel through a tense cat-and-mouse duel, to trying to outmaneuver a tank, to beating a cyborg ninja senseless with your bare fists, to outsmarting a psychic by physically altering how you play the game, to staring down the barrel of a sniper rifle, all in the space of about an hour of actual gameplay, if you know what you're doing. As a game, as a mechanical experience, its pacing legitimately begins to resemble less the foreboding, wandering horror of Escape from New York, from which the character of Snake was obviously drawn, and more something like the high-octane scenes in the later James Bond films, Rambo or Die Hard. With all the disparate set pieces you rocket between, it feels like a borderline boss rush. I mean, hell, despite not having health bars defining them as such, a whole lot of the combat set pieces with more regular guards are themselves drawing very directly from boss battles in Metal Gear's past. There exists very little gameplay here that isn't a boss fight, or isn't in direct service of overcoming one. And it's not just the dizzying rate at which you move between these encounters. It's the pacing and lead up to each of them individually that remains super impressive. You have two incredibly tense sniper duels, simultaneously subdued and absolutely frenzied, as you try to sufficiently steady your nerves in order to prevail, sandwiching the explosive battle against a Hind D, with the actual fight here serving as the climax to a condensed action movie sequence that really is lifted straight out of Die Hard. You fight your way up the tower, only for the Hind to destroy the bridge to the other tower, so you abseil down in a completely bespoke mechanical sequence that never appears again before sniping the enemies across the bridge below. You then work your way up another tower before you're left with no choice but to face down the gunship with a rocket launcher. And all of this takes place over the course of about 15 minutes. It turns the gunship into an actual villain in itself, its spectre haunting you throughout this entire sequence. And for as much as Solid is very much drawing from the more adventure game-esque design of its MSX predecessors, in which weapons largely have one intended use, to be rubbed on a certain object or enemy before being largely disregarded, there really is something to be said for the degree of flexibility you're afforded in some of these encounters. While everything about the first duel with Sniper Wolf, from its dire narrative circumstances to the narrow corridor in which it takes place, funnels you into a very specific kind of showdown, the second round, almost immediately following the Hind battle, allows for a bit more lateral thinking. Of course, the wider arena can actually heighten the tension found in the first encounter, as increased possibilities of where she could be hiding require you to up your game, the first go-around serving merely as training for this real battle. Or you could get a little underhanded with it, the game rewarding your ingenuity with a relative cakewalk of a fight. Vulcan Raven is a battle that hinges entirely on flexibility of approach, forcing you to get creative lest you get torn to shreds by his minigun. It's a fight that, rather than segment stealth and action, instead turns that stealth into the action. It's not enough to react in the moment you're caught. You have to plan ahead, without a comprehensive view of where he is at any given time. Just his ludicrously huge cone of vision, making this surprisingly large grid of an arena feel claustrophobically small. Like one wrong turn could land you in a whole world of hurt. What's more, the risk-reward for each strategy is balanced in such a way that even the sneakiest of approaches leaves you in constant danger. If you use missiles, for example, even from a distance, you're either trying to get a stinger shot off in what vanishingly little time you have before you're face to face with him, or you're navigating this grid with equally little idea of where he actually is, frantically trying to connect your Nikita with the barrel on his back before he notices and shoots you down, or you run out of fuel. Lay down claymores, and any hubris you might have knowing that he'll be brought down simply by walking around is balanced out by the mental map you have to maintain in order that this self-created minefield doesn't instead turn on you. It's all brilliant in its simplicity. And even when fights don't necessarily offer much in the way of flexibility, that isn't to say they don't reward thinking outside the box and getting a little devious with things. Take Psycho Mantis for instance, perhaps the most infamous battle in the series, up there as one of the all-time great boss fights. Here we have someone whose power is so all-encompassing that it extends outside of the game and its characters. It fits right in with the game's casually meta approach in a way that feels delightfully camp, but it is also downright creepy to have a character more or less address you directly, play tricks on you beyond the torment inflicted on Snake and Meryl. And in a similar vein, there's something that at the time felt monumental about having to physically alter how you play, the layout of the very console itself and how you interfaced with it in order to beat Mantis, a move whose staggering lack of imitators proves how radical its design kind of still is. And yet, simultaneously, that very same move feels hilariously trivial. Bring down this all-powerful psychic by simply switching the controller port. Through Metal Gear Solid's pride in its status as a video game, its insistence on referencing itself as such, Mantis is at once shown to be as tragically pathetic as he is terrifying. And this speaks to an interesting aspect of design specific to Metal Gear Solid that I think becomes apparent from its very first fight with Ocelot. On paper, this battle is almost comically simple. Chase a guy around a square and shoot him. Also, don't go in the middle. And as the remake found in Twin Snakes would show us, it is simple, to the point that in that GameCube title specifically, I almost read it as a kind of meta joke in itself, where the fight would be over in seconds simply by entering first-person mode and piling tranquilizers into his daft head. I actually talked about this in my video on Twin Snakes. The mechanical alterations brought in from Metal Gear Solid's sequel, Sons of Liberty, all serve to make things feel less uncanny, less overtly like you're playing a game with rules as distinct and blocky as its polygons. But as the Twin Snakes also shows us, by the fact that such quality of life additions also happen to break almost everything about its encounters, Metal Gear Solid was a game fundamentally designed around those rules and considerations. A swarm of guards magically appearing out of nowhere the second you even slightly step out of line might not be realistic, sure, but not knowing how or when the onslaught is going to stop, knowing you have to be super careful to avoid it happening again, navigating that chaos is tense in a way it decidedly isn't when you can just tranquilize every enemy from miles away before they have a chance to even spot you, let alone run away and radio in an alert. Similarly, sure, in a more traditional game, you might expect to be able to see the entirety of Ocelot's arena. Some might view the fact that you can't as some design fault or a clunky camera or whatever, but the fact that you are very deliberately limited from ever getting a full picture here means that you can't simply aim at where Ocelot is. You have to gain a sense for where he's going to be, how you might move in such a way that you can manipulate him to be in a certain position at a certain point. Your resources are limited thanks to the lack of a second tranquilizer pistol to switch between, making that crawl underneath the array of tripwires when you run out of SOCOM ammo, especially when you likely don't have a full idea of where your enemy is, even more chest tensioning. This is no mere vaguely interactive movie or whatever. Metal Gear Solid proudly leans into its status as a video game above all else, and this fact plays a key role in the ominous atmosphere created as Snake wanders through these dank, dingy arenas. And enduring these infamous, but honestly still relatively short, backtracking treks as you do to cool and then warm the PAL key, it all culminates in what many might not have realised at the time was already a series staple, one that would be iterated upon in each subsequent release, a one-on-one battle against the ultimate weapon, Metal Gear Rex. It's just that unlike the encounters of old, where you were running from side to side, planting mines or chucking near endless grenades until the little sprite flashed and went away, here we have more of a multi-stage dismantling process, an encounter that feels as colossal, as overwhelming as those prior battles were probably envisioned to look, as exemplified by the clever twist that the second phase sees you having to switch from chaff to stun grenades in order to have any effect. The machine is almost of secondary concern here. You're just frantically tearing away at its outer shell to reach the petulant, yet nonetheless animalistic rage at its core powering it all. It's just a shame then that the battle with Liquid Snake at the end of this process fails to live up to the grandeur of what you have just achieved. The final fight here represents a direct 3D modelling of yet another series hallmark, where the mech goes down in spectacular fashion, but there's still one more thing to sort out, or you've got to escape, where the villain's grand world-altering plans lie around them in flames, but their sheer hatred of you invigorates them to battle on in the face of oblivion. In amongst all the crazy schemes, this is personal. The bombast of any prior action is stripped away, as are the shirts, in a true showcase of raw strength, of honour, a one-on-one fistfight to the death. 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. You know, it's through this very format through which Big Boss's allegiances are made clear, with this kind of one-on-one battle forming the origin point of perhaps the defining question of this series. Just how and why did Big Boss turn bad? It is the most overtly cinematic, most traditionally dramatic setup for any of the encounters in the entire game, and yet it all falters, collapses for one simple reason. Metal Gear Solid as a series has never had particularly good melee combat. Even in the later games, where you saw a move towards a more traditional framework in terms of action shooter controls, where CQC became a more formalised part of the series parlance, it was rare for melee to feel like anything other than an accessory of the guns. And now strip away any mechanical complexity those later games might have, press circle to have Snake perform the weediest punch-punch-kick combo imaginable, with a swarm of hit detection issues to boot, and what in an action film might have served as a powerful, cathartic climax here turns into a frustrating, flailing mess. You might argue that the other melee-focused battle in the game against Grey Fox shares similar frustrations. And sure, in terms of raw mechanics, I do think the Cyborg Ninja fight is a bit of a slog. It's just that in that fight, at least hits more or less always connect when it looks like they should. And even then, you can at least say that such unpredictability is perhaps more thematically warranted, given the overall surreality of the character and the situation in which you fight them. You know, this doesn't feel so much like a fight as much as forcefully shutting down a machine gone rogue. And most importantly of all, you don't have to navigate said unpredictability on the tiniest platform imaginable under a time limit that Liquid gleefully wastes 30 full unskippable seconds of. God, this guy is just so eminently hateable. And that's just it. Even with what few stumbling blocks exist in the roster here, they're all presented so fantastically with the aforementioned character designs and such gloriously hammy performances from the entire cast that the totality of experience ends up winning out here. This roster has its ups and downs, but it represents an overall package so brimming with personality and absurdity and genuine pathos, a kind of weird line being navigated between a burning desire to kill Snake and outright respect for him, fascination at his tenacity, that it's just impossible to maintain much in the way of ill will towards the game in terms of its few mechanical shortcomings. Even by modern standards, these are encounters that manage to balance deliciously campy melodrama and real complexity. The fights are made more compelling in the moment precisely for this wealth of context you're provided, and you relish every chance you get to see them on screen, deepening their ongoing, complicated, individual relationships with Snake. I mean, it was playing through the game like this, of seeing this boss rush for what it really is, that recontextualized an aspect of the game's story that's always been in the back of my mind since I first played it way back when. See, part of the fascination that these enemies have with Snake, the respect that they have for him, revolves around the fact that to them, he isn't so different. This supposed hero saving the world from those who wish to undermine the American way of life is consistently gawped at by those in gas masks, as well as those getting nonchalantly pecked to death by birds, with Snake framed as if he is some kind of crazed psychopath, just like the rest of them, all summed up in Liquid's pithy retort that Snake, indeed, enjoys all the killing. It's something that always seemed a little funny to me, reflecting Snake's fervent defense from that accusation. This is a stealth game after all. You're not meant to play it super violently. There exist barely enemies to kill, in relation to more typical action games at least. And beyond that, there's so much talking that such gleeful basking in visceral excess always seemed like it was beside the point. But, you know, playing it in the way I have done recently, these bosses are straight up fun to engage with. They are assuredly video gamey in the way that the MSX bosses were. You maybe don't realise it because of the cutscenes and codec calls punctuating them, but there is barely any gameplay that isn't those bosses. You are given a lightning-fast assembly line of fun foes that, at this stage in the series' development, your only option is to kill. You are provided a wealth of means to do so. Even at the series' most mechanically limited, each method of dispatch creates a dynamic micro-narrative of how you specifically killed each boss. Your main mode of engagement isn't stealth, it's a veritable cornucopia of violence, one you're incentivized to go through again and again, where the incentives for doing so amount to more efficient means to kill, to get you to the killing. You have been turned into a gleeful machine of violence, and you didn't even realise it. What Metal Gear Solid proves is that you can have your cake and eat it to a certain extent. For a series so dubiously renowned for its emphasis on non-interactivity, Metal Gear Solid's boss battles, their frequency, their pacing, and the surprising flexibility they allow for illustrate a far more integral link between gameplay and narrative than the series in general, but especially that original, has never gotten a lot of credit for. A big part of the reason these characters have endured as long as they have is because, well, they basically are the entire game. The main vehicle through which you experience its narrative and interact with its systems. I don't know that there has been a better lineup of bosses in a Metal Gear game precisely because of this deeply intertwined relationship between the two. A relationship that, as we will come to see, is tested to various degrees in future installments. In its direct sequel's case, however, I have my reasons to suspect that this might have at least partly been deliberate. Sons of Liberty marks an interesting evolution in the series' boss design, as by its very nature, it should act as a pretty direct corollary to the experience of Metal Gear Solid 1. Its story is largely structured around the idea that the events of the Big Shell mimic those of Shadow Moses, so that the entire thing might function as an exercise to control information, to sculpt individuals through that very information control. And the hallmarks of that prior title are all there. You have a cyborg ninja secretly feeding you info. You take down an aircraft piloted by the main antagonist with a stinger. You go up against a ragtag group of appropriately comic book agents, seemingly mirroring the mercenaries of FOXHOUND in the form of Dead Cell. Even if the increase in resolution might see the realms of believability pushed when it comes to supernatural powers like this, in terms of narrative structure, MGS2 is, very deliberately, more or less that same prior game with the pieces switched around a little bit. And yet, when it comes to the boss fights that punctuate your progression, the texture of that game seems different somehow. Again, not accounting for cutscenes and codec calls, there's about as much gameplay here as there is in that first title, but in terms of those traditional one-on-one encounters, it feels as if there are not only less of them, but there's something distinctly strange about the ones that remain, a fact that will become increasingly relevant as we go. But to begin, we need to go back to perhaps the fundamental mechanical shift that separates the foes you battle in Sons of Liberty from those in Snake's former unit. Where the first game's challenge originated from its limitations as to how far into the distance you could see while still moving, aiming and shooting, 2 goes in the opposite direction, with many of the more typical fights being specifically designed around the newly added ability to aim, if not move, in first person. Where that first Ocelot fight had you frantically running around trying to outpace him, to anticipate where he's going to be rather than figure out exactly where he is, the tiered arena on which you fight Olga gives you very little room to maneuver at all. The barrier separating the 2 levels on which you both operate, basically forcing you to look through Snake's eyes to take her down. In that regard, Olga's battle has more in common with the sniper wolf fights found later in the first game, as you try to catch her peeking around the corners of the detritus strewn across the arena, all of it placed with absolute precision to keep you from ever developing a complete view of where your opponent could be. Add in the fact that at this point you only have the tranq pistol, forcing you to engage with the fact that even bosses can be taken down non-lethally here, and I'm not sure that there's a more comprehensively featured boss battle than Olga's the entire rest of the game. The one that comes closest, and might actually be the fight I enjoy the most, is Fat Man. He's a character with next to no screen time, but as he rollerblades into frame and ostentatiously smashes his cocktail glass to the floor, demanding to be respected as an artist, boy does he make the most of it. Continuing the trend of reversing the flow of how fights were structured in the first game, the layout of the strut-y rooftop on which you fight him brings to mind the grid structure of the cold storage unit where the Vulcan Raven fight took place. The strategies afforded to you are similarly varied, while the execution of these strategies will likely be just as frantic, with Fat Man adding in the hiccup of periodically and playfully flinging explosives about for you to find and defuse, meaning you're simultaneously swapping out your rations for the sensor. You're having to stop and stand in the one spot as you awkwardly fumble with coolant, all while you're hoping that the man himself doesn't roll by and drain your health. An over-the-top encounter for an over-the-top villain. It's great. Outside of that though, the Vamp battle feels like the logical evolution of the Olga fight, forcing you to navigate that Ocelot-style arena, replete with an insta-kill danger zone in the centre, as well as aim quickly across 2 levels, all while your opponent leaps faster than you can keep up with him. It's a logical escalation in mechanical challenge, but one where arbitrary invincibility, near constant projectiles, and fiddly controls turn this into an exercise in frustration more than hand-eye coordination. The Harrier fight is swifter, snappier than the Hind battle it evolved from, but I hesitate to call it better. Sure, it's good old-fashioned fun. It is satisfying to pile rocket after rocket into its frame as Solidus hurls Hollywood one-liners at you, all without the need to wait for the arbitrary video game time limit to run out before you're allowed to do damage again. But it also doesn't feel quite so intense. Relative to the tower descent and subsequent climb, leading to this blood-pumping action set piece in the middle of a blizzard, this fighter jet buzzing about seems to appear out of nowhere and is decimated just as quickly, which I guess speaks to the main way in which the fights in 2 differ from 1 in my mind: their pacing. You know, perhaps it's down to the game being broken up into 2 distinct sections, but where it felt like that first game couldn't wait to chuck another boss encounter your way, seeing you take on a good deal of the big enemies in the game within an hour if you were quick about it, that same hour in Sons of Liberty, even when skipping the cutscenes, is going to look downright sedate by comparison. I mean, you fight Olga, but then you'll largely be taking photographs, activating nodes, looking for and spraying bombs. You might say that minus the grim, dingy setting of that film, with the pseudonym of its now bemulleted hero, and its rescue the president with the nuclear football setup, Sons of Liberty slowing down like it does actually puts it more in line with the series' Escape from New York influence than the original game. I mean, by the time you get to another boss after the first Olga duel, it's not even a fight per se. You can see it from the achievements in the HD edition. No longer is it simply a case of defeating a laundry list of foes. In many cases here, you're meeting, you're colluding, you're surviving. And for what it's worth, I enjoy that process of survival. Figuring out that there's no way to hurt Fortune and that you've just got to wait out what becomes a flailing expulsion of rage is neat in itself. But there's also a fun challenge in trying to position yourself in such a way where you can most effectively avoid Fortune's gaze, almost as piercing as the railgun she wields. But where this starts to get really interesting for me is when you consider the narrative implications of fighting like this. If we view Raiden as an insert for the player, trained on virtual exercises based on the exploits of a hero he now has to live up to, then the fact that you can't physically beat every enemy in as cut and dry a manner as Snake did previously ends up conveying some of the game's narrative through mechanics, a destabilization of the player's idea of how games are supposed to work, how an operation modelled on Shadow Moses is meant to go down. I mean, outside of Psycho Mantis, and I suppose Decoy Octopus even though you don't confront him directly, FOXHOUND mainly comprised people who were simply good with guns. The big guy could lift a big one, the cowboy could spin a small one, and the sniper could, well, snipe. Here, we have someone who bullets seemingly cannot hit, and a man who can, by all accounts, cheat death, and for whom the sort of explanation of nanomachines wouldn't be made explicit until a game released several years later. Sure, you can get through the Metal Gear Ray fight, but you don't win it. You merely persist through a battle of attrition that you end up losing. A ramping up of the stakes you've become accustomed to for potentially 3 games at this stage, where you play through the levels and beat a Metal Gear at the end. Okay, well how about potentially 12 of the things? And at the end of it all, in a series that would go on to attempt to explain almost every discrepancy in its storytelling, Fortune shows up to illustrate that magic might just exist in this world somehow. It speaks to the deliberately overwhelming nature of the game's story, one designed to alienate. As Raiden collapses, exhausted, his identity, his sense of place is systematically razed to the ground, so too is the player's idea of how a Metal Gear game is supposed to play, how battles are meant to go, how a hero of these games is supposed to operate, succeed, and be rewarded for that success. The very nature of Sons of Liberty's boss battles, how often they appear and in what order, how you fight them, or in some cases don't, whether you're allowed to overcome them, all of it serves the larger meta-narrative here, in ways that go beyond simply questioning the player's complicity in violence. Sons of Liberty rules, man. But, you know, I suppose if there is a problem to be found with the roster here, it's that especially as you progress, the spectacle of these encounters can outshine what it is you're actually doing in them. A fight with an immortal vampire with a pool that will instantly drown you the second you fall into it descends into a decidedly awkward shooting gallery. a Harrier piloted by that same vampire and the former president of the United States in a mad muscle suit, later retrieved by a massive hostile mech, is nonetheless something that you just pile missiles into until it stops. And as thematically appropriate as such a repetitive grinding procedure is, and for as striking as the image of these machines towering over Raiden produces, there's little to the fight itself other than run, shoot at leg, shoot at mouth. The image of Solidus sprinting and leaping around to stop the rogue rays after your fight is burned into my memory as one of the coolest sequences in all of video games, with the relatively mundane process of taking them down yourself serving as little more than a means of getting to that cutscene. But once again, the worst of all has to be that final encounter, a similar setup to the conclusive fight with Liquid in the first game, where the plan to stop the Patriots lies in ruin around our antagonist, and amongst the debris and psychological torment, all that remains is to battle one-on-one. The visual design of the fight is upped dramatically in terms of ridiculousness alone. The former president of the United States now dons some Dr. Octopus-esque tentacles and throws you a samurai sword with which to sort this out once and for all, on top of Federal Hall no less. And yet, despite a bigger arena and generally smoother movement afforded by Sons of Liberty's fidelity, by making the absurd decision to map the sword controls to the right analog stick, the mechanics of this battle end up wildly imprecise in somehow a completely different way to the first game. The camera totally unequipped to deal with Solidus zooming around the battlefield, while you flimsily swing your katana around using either the lethal or inexplicably non-lethal blade, and hope that A, your swing connects, B, that he's not arbitrarily blocking, and C, that you don't inadvertently press down on the analog stick and commit to a piercing attack, leaving you vulnerable and unable to move. It's an absolute mess of a fight, and mechanically, if not visually or tonally, a real low note for the game to go out on. But even with these sometimes familiar mechanical deficiencies, it's the narrative heft of these battles, both their metatextual qualities as well as the complex characterization of the individuals involved, that more than makes up for how these encounters can sometimes play. It can often be difficult to tell who is friend and who is foe. Their motives serve as part of the game's larger mystery, and for the most part, their arcs are explored across the entirety of the game's runtime, frequently interweaving directly with your own adventure. Their need to get revenge on those who pulled the strings on all the hardship they endured is consistently countered with the fact that those same people are still pulling their strings. These people are awful, they do awful things, but you could also argue that they are victims in their own right. In short, and despite their powers, they are human. They aren't just enemies, they're characters. And outside of maybe Fat Man, they are as vital to Raiden's story as Raiden is to theirs. And this is an important point, because after Sons of Liberty, we begin to see what happens when this balance becomes inverted, where the mechanical possibilities of boss battles are expanded to an extent previously unseen in the series, but where that underlying humanity starts to waver somewhat, and the results, as it turns out, are pretty compelling. And I hope you'll bear with me on this, because this is where things get a little difficult. See, with its vastly increased scope of mechanical possibilities afforded to players, with a level of systemic detail that sees the game border on immersive sim territory, Metal Gear Solid 3 is regarded by many to be the peak of the franchise. Its story represents an absolutely vital part of the series canon, the origin of Big Boss, and what's more, it's told with an efficiency, a charm that retains the series' wackiness and complexity, but in a manner that's less cold, less concerned with deliberately alienating players than simply telling a compelling tale. If we examine its boss battles, however, in the context of what strengths have emerged in prior games, then while Snake Eater offers some of the best of the entire franchise in that regard, it also offers what at this point in the series' release timeline, in 2004, could feasibly be considered some of the worst. Again, bear with me on this one, I'm going somewhere with it. It all starts off strong, with Ocelot's return as the game's first true boss, serving as a microcosm of the overall experience to be found here, providing a similarly confined arena and restricted view of proceedings to the Olga fight in 2, in line with the campier tone of the game's 60s spy thriller narrative. Ocelot's fight here is much more playful in nature, with this arena serving as more of a sandbox with which to experiment in a way that you've hopefully become somewhat accustomed to this deep into the playtime, relative to how quickly its predecessors wanted to get you into these big battles. If the first hour of gameplay in Metal Gear Solid 1 saw you cascading through and finding the solutions to all of these disparate combat puzzles, Snake Eater opts instead to use that same hour to provide a series of lower stakes encounters, encouraging experimentation as to just how deep the systemic interactions go here. And at the end of that, you have Ocelot acting as a cherry on top, as if to say, all that wild stuff you were messing around with in the main game, it's all fair play here. The wealth of variables that can affect this first battle alone that can be messed with goes far beyond anything seen in any prior Metal Gear. Beehives can be shot, his hat can be taken off his bonds, his guards can shoot at you, and crucially, your arsenal at this point in the game will be comparatively heaving, giving you all sorts of choices as to your loadout and strategy, how the weight of said loadout might affect stamina drain and the like. A loadout that can include tools as diverse as the poisonous snakes you've collected along your travels. And it's a flexibility that extends to the very paratext of the game itself, as Ocelot's proclamations as to the pure joy of reloading during a battle, a kind of mini cutscene in itself, can be skipped by the player, cutting through the character's affected grandeur, leaving him standing in the middle of the battlefield like a sitting duck, like a total dafty, a move that fits right in with the hubris we've seen him pay for so embarrassingly several times at this point, at the hands of Big Boss. You know, the flexibility of approach here doesn't just allow for emergent storytelling. As boss fights like this exemplify, such flexibility can be tied very directly to a character's ongoing development. It's difficult to envision an encounter more representative of the game at large, especially when this is the first boss fight you come across. And so, with that in mind, what is the supposed big problem with Snake Eater's boss roster then? Well, it's an issue that begins to reveal itself almost immediately following the Ocelot fight, and it comes in the form of the Cobras, a series of surprisingly rapid-fire battles with this game's take on the weirdo mercenary unit. And while I will be upfront and say I don't think there's necessarily what I'd call a bad boss battle in here, I obviously still love this game so dearly and have a great time with it. In terms of the Cobras specifically, it represents the main point of deviation between the original titles and the games going forward. And all of it can be summed up in one question. What do you really know? What can you tell me about the Fury? See, in terms of raw gameplay, like with many of the Cobra battles, the Fury provides more than enough groundwork for an invigorating encounter, in which the murky depths of the underground labyrinth in which you encounter him are lit up only by the flames pouring down the corridors from this enraged cosmonaut. Of course, using the sniper rifle, the mechanics of taking this guy down aren't particularly challenging. And much like the rest of the bosses here, the speed with which you can drain their health bar can come as a bit of a shock. But similarly to the Vulcan Raven fight in 1, all it takes is one wrong turn here, and you're suddenly caught in the middle of an inferno that proves devilishly difficult to escape. Simply whipping out your gun isn't an option anymore, and you need to roll to put the flames out, head into your cure menu to heal the burns, all while getting the hell out of dodge. The ease with which the Fury's jetpack allows him to vault these uneven walls between corridors significantly outpaces your ability to do the same. The thing is though, if you ask random players to actually tell you anything truly substantive about the Fury other than he wears a spacesuit, or about the Fear other than he's kind of a bug guy with a crossbow, that the pain likes bees, or the end is old and photosynthesizes somehow, I'm willing to bet the vast majority of people would come up pretty short. Honestly, I've beaten this game countless times and I couldn't do much better. It says a lot that despite the obvious gameplay strengths of the fight itself, I legitimately consistently forget that the Fury even exists. For as cool, as creepy as the Cobras are in concept, each representing a move towards something more playfully monstrous, like they were ripped straight out of Kamen Rider or Super Sentai or something, none of them, bar maybe the Sorrow, are anywhere near as integral to the plot as FOXHOUND is in 1, or even Dead Cell in 2. In fact, they don't really exist for any other reason than to nominally aid the boss. Part of the reason the original's bosses were so memorable and iconic is because we spend actual time with them. They have personalities of their own, and crucially, their engagements with Snake form part of their own separate arcs. In short, they get time to exist outside of that brief period in which their health bar lies underneath your own. The theatrics of Psycho Mantis illustrate how casually powerful he is. He effortlessly messes with Snake's psyche, your own understanding of how games and their technology are supposed to work. There's something downright cordial about the way Raven approaches Snake. He warns the higher-ups not to underestimate him, and cuts directly to Snake's core as he talks of how much our protagonist seems to enjoy this. Grey Fox is an old friend. Sniper Wolf marks Snake as a target, viewing him with as much flirtatious admiration as avarice. I could go on. The Cobras, by comparison, seem to only make passing mention of Snake as the boss's apprentice, and that's kind of it. It's a problem by no means exclusive to 3, but Snake Eater marks a definitive point at which its boss roster, specifically the big bad unit Snake will have to dismantle member by member, becomes more and more distant from the story being told, representing a focus on surface-level character designs and concepts, with little in the way of actual substance fleshing said concepts out. And even with the increased flexibility afforded to many of these encounters, it all butts up against the reality that, at least on normal difficulty, and again I'm just examining this in terms of how most players will probably experience these battles, there's not much reason to actually utilize it. Like, it's a funny, cool idea that in order to rid yourself of the pain's pheromones, drawing his bees or hornets or whatever closer to you, you have to change your camouflage, get out of those clothes and into new, fresh ones. It's also something that, thanks to how effective the shotgun just is against him, I've never once thought about actually doing. I only remembered that it was a factor in this fight on this recent playthrough, where I happened to hear it mentioned in a codec call. Similarly, it sure is neat that you can essentially turn the Fear's survivalist tendencies against him, balancing your need to eat and maintain stamina with the potential to use that same food in order to lure him into a trap. It represents a leveling of the playing field, that this boss, like you, plays by the same systemic rules. It doesn't help though that even willingly foregoing the thermal goggles that readily reveal his exact location and straight up break a good deal of the encounters across this game, his movements through the trees are not exactly difficult to track, and only become easier as his stealth suit breaks and sparks from damage. The mechanical nuances to many of the Cobra battles are fun. They allow for emergent player-driven storytelling to an extent. I'm glad they exist. It is better that these details are in the game than if they weren't. But there's surprisingly little incentive driving you towards those more intricate tactics, other than a need to spice things up on your own terms, to needlessly toy with your prey a little. The basic strategy is potentially disappointingly vanilla, sure, but it's also so damn effective. This might sound odd, but the Cobras specifically represent the first point, for me anyway, where the encounters outside of boss battles often prove more interesting than the bosses themselves. With multiple guards patrolling any given area, each with their own routes and routines, maintaining stealth is of heightened importance. There's a noxious tension associated with the knowledge that around any corner could lie a guard you had no idea about, and suddenly whatever plan you might have is thrown into disarray. And with restrictions placed on everything from suppressors to radar batteries, previously optimal strategies like tranquilizing everyone at a distance are now complicated, requiring you to think about both the short and long-term consequences of any shot, any step taken throughout this jungle. And with all of that in mind, messing around with the more overtly immersive sim-esque elements of the game's design, finding methods with which to effectively place a spanner in the works, using your limited resources, say for example using an explosive to disrupt their food supply, leaving them less alert, provides real, tangible mechanical benefit in a way it perhaps doesn't in many of the boss encounters here, where there's simply one enemy and one health or stamina bar to bring down to zero, where the suppressors can come off entirely because stealth is far less of a concern. Let me put it this way, if typical encounters in Snake Eater are reminiscent of First Blood's more overtly tense sequences in which Rambo is vastly outnumbered and has to improvise his way through any given scenario, then the Cobras can begin to resemble that bit in Rambo 4 where he jumps on that machine gun jeep and proceeds to viscerally dismantle the driver. Now, an exception to this is, as you might guess, what is considered to be one of the best fights across the entire series, the sniper battle with the End. And I think this largely comes down to the fact that, as evidenced by his being replaced by 8 of the Ocelot unit, should you manage to take him out earlier, his battle functions like one of those regular guard scenarios on steroids. The vast arena, or several arenas in which you fight him, providing a delightful push and pull. The knowledge that you have no idea what lies beyond the safety of the jungle brush, and that you could be being watched at all times, necessitating a careful, measured approach, countered by the fact that he might not even be in the area you are very slowly making your way through. Of course, at least on normal difficulty, there isn't a whole lot to be lost by simply running through an area, taking the inevitable hit, and simply looking for the lens flare to give his location away. But certainly more so than any other Cobra, every potential strategy, every piece of equipment, every trap placed to cover your tracks, every parrot captured feels warranted. It's all valid here because for the most part, you're operating on exactly the same stealth principles that govern your movement through the regular game world. And while he does fall foul of the same narrative shortcomings of the other Cobras, amounting to little more than an old dude that comes and goes, the wealth of potential Easter eggs and fun methods of taking him out at least bring him somewhat more in line with the metatextual qualities that made, say, Psycho Mantis so memorable. And, you know, those Cobras strike me as particularly odd, because the shift between the Cobra unit and the battles that follow it is so drastic it's downright whiplash-inducing. Not only is the whole sequence with Volgin and the Shagohod appropriately bombastic and momentous for what might be the most genuinely despicable villain in the series, but that final battle with the boss represents perhaps the pinnacle of that gameplay story synthesis that the Cobras were so lacking. First off, Volgin. It's cool that even after all these years, I'm not sure what is generally considered the correct way to take Volgin down, and yet whatever way I do always feels rewarding, usually amounting to some combination of chaff grenades, CQC, and shooting him while he's down. An underhanded strategy that nonetheless feels deserved for someone who so consistently treats everyone around him with an almost cartoonish level of sociopathy. A man who cares deeply about being perceived as the strongest. And this battle, with the added touch of an increasingly jaded Ocelot leveling the playing field for you somewhat, sees you throw him around like it was nothing. It's basically the Liquid fight in reverse, replete with bratty petulance, just with better combat mechanics, starting off with a hand-to-hand sequence, and then evolving into an absolute barn burner of a chase and eventual confrontation. Eva's inability to move the bike particularly fast to make the most of shooting out its treads aside, this is one that leans fully into the camp, as Eva and Snake finally embrace under the fireworks provided by Volgin's rapidly exploding body. It's Bond bordering on Austin Powers. It is beautiful. But nothing compares to the fight that follows with the boss. Everything about it is so deliberately designed. the field of lilies lilting in the gentle breeze contributing to the overwhelming melancholy of this encounter, the flower serving as a symbol of fertility and rebirth, as it provides tactical advantage for your camouflaged opponent. It's the fact that her combat style is one of the game's key mechanics, a style Naked Snake developed with her and that now you must best her at, one whose seemingly effortless but nonetheless overwhelming power in using an enemy's weight and momentum against them is matched only by the intensity of personal connection you share with her through that very style. The boss is mechanical storytelling at its very best. After the unfortunate fumbling of the Cobra unit, this is Kojima proving that he has still very much got it. The fact that the gameplay is matched so closely with the story being told, this representing the peak of the student surpassing the master archetype, is what elevates the boss far above even the end in my opinion. It's the best, most direct, most convincing attempt the series has made up to this point in building a battle around out-stealthing one's opponent, around the mechanics the series built its identity on rather than simply straight-ahead action. It just manages to be the most narratively resonant battle at the same time. Hell, the fact that the boss has had to do almost this exact same thing before, taking out someone she loves for the sake of the mission, for the sake of her son who was being held captive by the philosophers, as hinted at earlier, retroactively renders the sorrow with all his paranormal tomfoolery and nightmare murder corridor puzzles by far the most narratively compelling of the Cobras at least. The boss and her accompanying setup is all so good that she makes other aspects of the game better. You know, I tend to think that the deliberately experimental construction of 2 cements it as one of my all-time favourite games, but this recent playthrough of 3 really highlighted just how much I truly adore this story when it really gets going. Its latter half moves at a staggering clip, which I guess makes it unfortunate that only about half of its bosses actually play meaningfully into said story. And when presented with that fork in the road, between utterly transcendent battles thanks to their narrative and thematic resonance, and mechanically flexible encounters that nonetheless sacrifice a lot of that narrative identity, that humanity, in favour of what might appear as cool concepts, it becomes interesting, if depressing, to see how Metal Gear Solid as a series decides to go all in down that latter path from this point on. Something we'll see as we move onto one of the more divisive entries in the franchise. This is one I feel I need to preface once again by saying I am absolutely a defender of Metal Gear Solid 4. It's a decidedly daft game in many ways, but that doesn't mean I don't love it. Quite the opposite. I made a whole video talking about how one could read its depiction of a world overcome by absurd, confusing, dystopian decay in the same way that Sons of Liberty is viewed as an oddly prophetic examination of what the internet would become. Let me be clear, I love a lot about Guns of the Patriots. I just don't think I'm saying anything that's going to shake anyone to their core in stating that its bosses are almost universally lackluster. The problem here is that when it comes to the bosses specifically, it just doesn't seem like there's all that much to talk about, with the Beauty and Beast unit that form its central band of ruffians sitting at that unfortunate intersection of lacking the narrative heft found in prior titles, while also falling foul of the game's more traditionally action-centric framework, resulting in most bosses here being absent both personality as well as any real ingenuity in terms of how you take them down. It's not even like there's much ingenuity in design either, with half the unit more or less serving as a copy and paste job from another better game, just without the careful pacing and narrative context that lent those prior encounters any weight. Instead, the appearance of Crying Wolf and the sniper duel that accompanies it, in the exact same snowfield as your fight with Sniper Wolf all those years ago, manages to cheapen a sequence specifically designed to play on nostalgia, where once occurred one of the most harrowing moments of that first game, in which Snake conveys his admiration of a warrior drowning in her own blood before putting her out of her misery. The gunshot accompanied by the pained wails of her wolves now lies a person we don't know, having just crawled out of a weird robot and turned to stone after the camera leered at her and we shot her some more as she walked sultrily towards us for some reason, I guess guess Kojima fancied the models or something? Oh, and then Drebin tells us about how traumatic this stranger's past was via codec. Cool, let's move on. The Cobras had a stronger identity than this. I guess the twist of the Screaming Mantis fight, where you need to shoot the doll controlling everyone's nanomachines or whatever, is at least something resembling a twist on the formula seen in the rest of the fights. With Vamp, you at least have to figure out that you need to inject him with the syringe to disable his nanomachines. That said, there's something about the move to this more standardized third-person shooter control scheme, away from having to figure out what kind of claw-like grip you'd have to inhabit in order to perform some relatively simple task, and towards endless guns with endless ammo that renders all these fights by comparison a little safe and relatively unexciting, even outside their lack of any real context. It's all just trying to find the most efficient means of firing at someone you likely don't care about. Now, it's not that Guns of the Patriots is a game where flashy, over-the-top moments don't occur in spades. I distinctly remember watching that footage of Raiden fighting the geckos dozens of times back in school and basically salivating at what I was seeing. This was the wildest thing ever to me back then. It's just that outside of the Rex vs. Ray fight, one of the only truly mechanically distinct boss encounters across your playtime, and one whose bombast still largely holds up in a kid smashing action figures together kind of way, Metal Gear Solid 4 is a game where it often seems like the really cool stuff is happening while Snake isn't looking, while you're not in control. Again, I have beaten this game several times over the years, and it's only when I made that last video on it back in 2019, reviewing footage of my captured playthrough, that I realised I had never actually seen the fight between Raiden and Vamp on top of Rex in full before. I'd only ever caught glimpses because I was always too busy focusing on slowly shooting at these daft geckos. It's a neat camera trick for sure, but as with a lot about Metal Gear Solid 4, it's more interesting when you're not playing. And look, I know everyone always talks up the final climactic battle between Ocelot and Snake as this massive, multi-tiered trip down memory lane as health bars, perspectives, and soundtracks shift to emphasize just how deep, how long-lasting, how acidic this generational rivalry has been. This is it. This is what you've waited 4 games and an entire decade to do, and to me, it mostly has the same mechanical problems of the Liquid fight. The same tantalizing setup, where the villain's plan has been thwarted and all that's left is to fist fight to the death, mostly let down by the weediest of melee systems. I guess at least there's not a time limit to deal with this go around. So while I definitely have a soft spot for Guns of the Patriots, in terms of its boss design, it's hard to argue that it doesn't represent a major step back. Where Snake Eater made up for a rather limp cast up front, with some of the series' most meaningful encounters in the back end, Metal Gear Solid 4's bosses never reach anything close to that mechanical engagement, nor, crucially, that level of humanity that has really come to define the best battles in this series. And so, to recap, with Snake Eater, a large issue with around half the bosses was that they lacked any real discernible identity beyond their immediate job, to take you out in service of the boss. In Guns of the Patriots, Kojima and team decided to double down on this approach, rather than focus on the truly transcendent, narratively resonant battles of Snake Eater's latter half. So, as the humanity of these encounters seems to dwindle with each subsequent entry, it would of course make sense for a follow-up to truly turn things around by having you fight a bunch of vehicles, near identical mechs that are almost exclusively controlled by an AI rather than a human, right? This, as we'll come to see, is the case with perhaps the series' definitive portable entry, 2010's Peace Walker, and upon initial glance, despite the game being a standout for many fans, its boss roster is as disappointingly mundane as it sounds. In a way, I can see what the team might have been going for. If you view the Metal Gear or Metal Gear adjacent mech battles as the climactic encounters in these games, the ones where the bad guy's plan comes to fruition and you suddenly have to take out a gargantuan beast before you against all odds, then a whole game of that probably sounds pretty cool. The battles increase in enormity from a lowly armoured vehicle through to these hulking machines of death. great fortresses that need to be physically traversed in some cases, representing perhaps the greatest chasm in the franchise between their enormity and your relative insignificance. Indeed, it can be difficult to even know where to begin with some of these machines, and ostensibly there are a bunch of different means by which you could approach them. Do you attempt to weaken them by taking out some of the weapons that adorn this vast chassis, or do you aim straight at the glowing weak spot, ensuring you endure the maximum barrage, but hopefully for a shorter time if you're smart about it? The problems, however, largely arise from the alterations made to the game's larger design, namely its focus on collaboration. Beyond the fact that Peace Walker's plot is not merely a solo sneaking mission, but rather a larger attempt to build an army, a nation of some kind, with all sorts of features by which you are not the sole operator in any given scenario, this kind of camaraderie was also intended to extend to other players in the real world. That is to say, while these bosses can very well be taken down solo, it rarely feels like that was the intended experience. The issue mainly just comes down to how spongy these enemies are. While the scale may be similar in some cases, old school Metal Gear battles in which you identify a weak spot and quickly take it out, these are not. Damage numbers fly out of these enemies as rapidly as you can pile round after round into them, but rarely do you get much of a feel for how much damage you're actually doing. Contrary to the game design's emphasis on compact missions well suited to pick up and play portability, as per its original PSP release, as the game progresses, so too does the time investment required for these hulking behemoths. Seriously, you can be piling rockets into the AI pods for up to 15 minutes in later encounters, and wondering when your barrage is going to be sufficient to take off even one bar of these seemingly endless health pools. Those 15 minutes are rarely broken up by any kind of alternate phase either, like when Grey Fox destroys the Radome or Volgin takes physical control of the Shagohod. And so, playing solo, your experience is going to alternate between near constant fire, broken up only by the frequent need to resupply. A potentially compelling experience as you flip between ever-dwindling resources on the fly and manage the time between recharging supply drops as best you can, but it's an experience whose ever so slightly sluggish controls, another remnant of its PSP origins where camera controls were limited to face buttons, can leave Snake feeling more than a little under-equipped to bob and weave through the relentless onslaught of these comparatively nimble foes. Further, the sheer drawn-out nature of these battles not only contributes to a creeping sense of monotony, but you perhaps start to wonder if you're playing the game right, if this method of play is the intended one. Because look, back in the day, I played through Peace Walker with a friend, accommodated by heavily emphasized network features, and believe me when I say in that instance, all talk of tactics went out the window. In co-op, I remember absolutely demolishing these things in record time. The potential strategy of whether to take out the weapons or the weak spot first would simply be answered with why not both. I could be wrong on this, but I don't remember the boss health or damage output scaling to match an increase in player force, turning these once monotonously protracted encounters into something potentially worse, downright trivial. But the thing is, when it comes to what strategy does exist here, and contrary to basically all the footage you've been seeing here, which was captured in service of just getting through the fights as quickly as possible, you don't actually want to be doing too much damage to the AI pod in the first place, as tempting as those increased numbers might be. To do so is to deny yourself resources, in what ends up becoming one of the smarter narrative tricks the game pulls, even if, mechanically speaking, it's more than a little convoluted. See, at the end of every encounter with these machines, you pop the lid of the AI pod controlling them and clamber in, so that you may disrupt its programming by removing modules, and importantly, these modules are themselves collectibles. Now, just what the game wants you to do to what bits of each boss in order to unlock these modules but not damage them so much so that they break is all more than a little diffuse, and even with guides, it'll all be subject to a frustrating amount of RNG, meaning whichever approach you do take, you're going to be grinding bosses repeatedly for certain modules. And this is a problem with a good deal of the mission design generally later on. But you can rest assured that all of this effort, all of these collectibles, are contributing to something much larger: the building of your very own project, Metal Gear Zeke. You are incentivized to fight as cleanly as possible so that you may be rewarded with a more advanced version of the very thing that has come to define villainy throughout this series: your very own nuclear-equipped walking battle tank. You fight hard for it, you grind for it, but that in itself doesn't represent some noble act of heroism worthy of reward. That building a Metal Gear turns out to be the ultimate goal is a neat bait and switch in itself, but its revelations go far beyond that. See, while the game nominally ends after you take down Peace Walker, the true ending is locked behind the completion of that Zeke, and the many, many missions you have to do in order to see it finished. After slogging to find an escaped Zadornov for the zillionth time, Paz reveals herself to be a double agent, hijacking your own mech and unveiling the actual climactic boss battle of the game, Zeke itself. It's a battle whose sting is sharpened by the realization that the more extensively you built up Zeke, the more grinding you did for those AI modules and the optional parts you were able to graft onto this beast as a result, have now created a far more difficult fight for yourself. Even at its weakest, Zeke still represents 10 grueling minutes of dodging railgun fire and hoping your supply drops contain rations, as your health is unceremoniously stomped away. The kind of slog that will make you wish you hadn't invested in all that extra armor or jetpacks, currently making your job concretely harder. You know, as soon as Snake Eater revealed Big Boss to be the player character, talk had always turned to how and when such a charming, likeable protagonist in Naked Snake was going to turn into this villain we were initially introduced to him as. What heinous act was he going to indulge in that would cement his legacy as one of evil? What has become clear though, especially in the wake of the disappointment surrounding future games in the series, is that this one definitive moment was never going to come, and instead this Zeke fight serves as something of a focal point, where you're forced to reflect on all of these little moments throughout the series that see a man gradually turned against a government, a country, an ideology he had previously fought so hard for. That while Big Boss's actions may not be definitively evil, they're hardly those you'd associate with a decent, upstanding moral figure. And Peace Walker, with its reward system ultimately revolving around and incentivizing the development of a devastating weapon of war, one that will eventually turn against you and you will have to destroy, manages to gamify that lurching realization about Big Boss's character in a way that lays waste to the typical criticism Kojima endures, that he just makes movies rather than games. Nah man, this is straight up Ludo narrative at its purest, subversion of the reward systems we've come to expect from this medium in order to convey a character's subtle downfall, as well as your own complicity in that fall from grace in a manner that goes far deeper than just words. And sure, the actual process of retrieving the AI pods begins to represent a frustratingly protracted exercise in itself, as you find yourself unable to exit even when you've picked up everything you can, requiring you to awkwardly wait out the clock. But this simple mechanic also represents further opportunity for character development. Take the last battle with Peace Walker, where after spending upwards of 15 minutes taking this thing down, you are tasked with surgically dismantling the closest thing that remains to your mentor, the boss, the person upon whose character, whose principles this AI was based, both as a means of deterring nuclear threats, as well as provide answers to what happened at the end of Snake Eater. A clarity, a closure that's as tantalizing to Snake as it is to the AI's creator, Strangelove. And before that clarity is afforded to the people seeking it out, in order to stop Peace Walker from causing a nuclear strike, Snake must destroy this AI piece by excruciating piece. The process is as languid as it ever has been, now requiring that every single module be removed over the course of several minutes, but such protraction is imbued with a real melancholy here, distinctly absent from prior encounters. As butterflies inexplicably swarm around you, you're treated to minutes of this facsimile of the boss, going from a regular cadence of speech, proclaiming the grand philosophies the character is known for, to reciting basic rhymes, to simply stating plain facts such as the exact value of pi, decaying into an approximation of pi, before slumping into pained gasps of your name as you gradually remove what humanity exists here. Just as Snake was tasked with doing back in Metal Gear Solid 3, as the boss chose to tarnish her own legacy for the sake of the mission. It's a moment dense with wonderful thematic meaning, and represents Big Boss at maybe his most nakedly emotional in the entire series, as a mix of repressed sorrow and fury erupt in a futile outburst, with Big Boss hammering against this wall of circuitry, desperate to find the closure he'll never get, seeking a humanity that never really existed. And I guess that predicament sums up my issue with Peace Walker's boss roster as a whole. For all that its bosses end up playing into some of the best gameplay narrative, nothing can disguise the fact that said gameplay amounts to piling bullet after bullet, missile after missile into similar looking, similarly functioning machines, leaving you grasping for that humanity, that character that made those prior enemies so deeply memorable. At the end of the day, it's all just hunks of metal. But you know, at least you could definitively call these boss battles. See, to even say that the last true entry in the series, Metal Gear Solid 5, has bosses to speak of, is itself a controversial statement, because many fans would argue that this simply isn't the case. With the exception of one encounter, those definitive moments where it's just you going head to head with another enemy with a giant health bar in the top left of the screen are decidedly a thing of the past here. It's interesting that what was once a key pillar of the series' gameplay identity has seemingly been so stripped away in what many would still confidently say is the best a Metal Gear game has ever actually played. Those boss battles, those missions you select, where the ultimate or even primary objective is to deal with some superpowered enemy in your path, are actually fairly plentiful. It's just that MGS5 is obviously a far more open game than before, and with that comes a desire to do away with the more segmented aspects of its world and game design, to more seamlessly integrate battles like this into the grander mechanical milieu. They surprise you, they appear out of seemingly nowhere, and when a cutscene does accompany their arrival, shaky handheld style camera work and minimal cuts heighten that feeling of unplanned unease. Those health bars do exist, it's just that they have to be unearthed through the same means by which you mark any other enemy. They exist as part of this world, largely within the mechanical rules of this world, just like every other inhabitant of this world. Even if said inhabitants do happen to be endless variations on the same parasite-ridden super zombies completely devoid of personality. And it's that last part that proves to be the actual problem with MGS5's boss design, and where the series ended up in that regard. Because there's a reason that this piece has, against all odds, seen me going back and picking up my Steam Deck almost every day to get a quick hit of a game I exhaustedly said I was done with long ago. Because separate from that issue, separate from any need for context or personality or explanation for these fights, said encounters do have the potential to be absolutely thrilling. Your bumping into Quiet, for example, is mechanically one of the better sniper battles in the series. Her appearance, communicated seamlessly by regular in-game HUD elements, jolts you to attention with a mission within a mission whose scope, pardon the pun, you likely aren't prepared for at that point in the game, capturing an appropriate level of surprise for such a duel. The mechanical possibilities are as vast as the arena it takes place in, itself delightfully vertical and littered with rubble, providing as much tactical advantage to your opponent as it does you. feeling very similar to The End in that way where you start suspecting every errant rock or pebble sticking out of the ground. I can honestly say that there are few emergent storytelling moments in games that stick out as vividly in my mind as coming up against Quiet for the first time, and lacking the Trank sniper rifle with which to non-lethally take her down. I didn't want to simply bypass this opportunity to find out more about this character though, so rather than escaping, I found myself hunkering down, utilising my already comically underpowered Trank pistol, and accounting for wild bullet drop as I no-scoped her across this entire area, in order that I could whittle her health down for far too long. It's not a feat I've ever bothered to replicate, in part thanks to the realisation that in the grand scheme of things, such effort is for naught. Whether you use a Trank pistol or send a bunch of rockets her way, the outcome of the encounter is the same. It certainly takes the wind out of those player-driven narrative sails a bit, as your plans boil down to a canned shoot her or don't binary choice at the end of the day. But the process of getting to that point, of testing the limits of the game's systems and having the game accommodate that scrutiny, for me represents the open world philosophy of the Phantom Pain at its purest, at its best. And when it comes to what you might call boss battles in Metal Gear Solid 5 as a whole, this notion of unceremoniously dropping you into situations you aren't prepared for, and in some cases have little to no means of effectively dealing with at the point at which you encounter them, actually ends up becoming something of a running theme. In fact, I'd go as far as to say there are fewer battles where defeating enemies is an outright requirement than there are those that encourage you to simply run away. In a way, this approach could actually be seen as admirable. If you view boss battles as a test of the skills players will have hopefully learned by that point, a kind of concentrated, heightened blast of the key mechanics of any given game, then there is perhaps something to be said for the Phantom Pain's encounters largely going back to the series' stealth roots, while embracing its open world setting and design that encourages improvisation, giving you control of these ridiculously asymmetrical encounters and saying go nuts. That level of control placed in your hands against what often feel like insurmountable odds at first, enemies with power and focus that far outweighs your own, is often as terrifying as it is freeing. Plus, it also has the added benefit of framing Snake as the fish out of water he decidedly is, staring these foes in the face and managing to utter nary a word, in a way that ends up becoming pretty thematically relevant given the game's narrative maneuvers later on. It's just that the game ends up leaning so heavily on this approach that it rarely feels like you're ever actually making an impact against these enemy forces, let alone definitively overcoming them. Besides the constant reuse of the skulls, I'm willing to bet that part of the reason fan consensus is that the game's boss roster is lacking comes down to the fact that so few of these encounters feel like those momentous, climactic one-on-one duels of prior titles. In a way, they lean so hard into the supernatural and hallucinatory that it's hard to tell if any of it is actually real. It's just that none of this alienation feels anywhere near as deliberate as it is in Metal Gear Solid 2. You know, each boss presents such overwhelming odds, seemingly so easily overpowering Snake, that rather than simply saying, you overcame this enemy by besting them in combat, the writers need to grasp more than ever towards workarounds, pushing the limits of contrivance to new levels, almost every time you manage to escape somehow. So many enemies in this world are basically unkillable, so they all just have to arbitrarily stop at some point. There's not really much of a reason or justification as to why the skulls or the man on fire simply stop pursuing you. They can endlessly come back, in the latter's case with the help of Psycho Mantis. They can easily outpace you, they just give up after a while. When you do decide to stand your ground and drain the skull's health, they get up and jump away for some reason. You know, even when Vamp's nanomachines kept him alive, you could just disable his nanomachines. Fortune's bullet dodging abilities stopped the moment their associated Patriot-controlled technology was disabled. Well, kind of. As daft as the internal logic might have been, there was indeed an internal logic running underneath all of this. It was at least somewhat consistent in its establishment of an enemy with a weakness that would prove key to said enemy's narrative arc. In Metal Gear Solid 5, the enemies just sort of exist until they don't anymore. And for a game whose narrative, whose very structure, serves to place the player at the centre of everything, to foreground their decisions in mission as the real story of the game, to celebrate the achievements of its audience as the true heroes all this time, it ends up feeling like you play very little role in that process. And in this sense, the bosses of the Phantom Pain act as a microcosm of the game's general narrative failings. In a vacuum, the gameplay of these fights has never been better. Snake is more responsive, he's snappier to control, and the potential scope of battles, the capabilities of your enemies, is greatly increased to boot, bringing as much tension to proceedings as freedom. But the game opens itself up to this extent at the cost of all the careful pacing and context that could make a far smaller fight feel infinitely more resonant. You know, when you unplugged your controller and put it in the second port in the first game, you felt like you'd really gotten one over on this once all-powerful psychic, brought low by something so functionally simple, yet so wild at that time in the context of game design. It contributed to that character's identity that they could only be taken down by messing with the very console itself. The skulls, by comparison, are just some soldiers. Quiet is just a sniper. It's the same issue as the Cobras or the Beauty and Beast unit, just minus the over-the-top mannerisms and designs of the former, nor even the reverence, however surface level, for what came before found in the latter. These bosses, unfortunately, are just nothing, as nondescript as any of the countless side ops you end up mindlessly trudging through. I guess at the end of the day, with the previews for Metal Gear Delta or Metal Gear Solid Delta hitting recently at the time of writing, and who knows, there's still time for that to become an absolute mess or the best thing ever, there has been some talk of how a series that for so long has been associated with this kind of lingering dread, thanks to how it has consistently been handled by Konami for the last decade, is finally starting to give people some hope again. The people working on it are able to talk about their efforts on previous games, their reverence for Kojima, etc. It feels like there are at least some strides being made to mend the issues of the past, to get these older games into the hands of those who might have missed them back in the day. And who knows, maybe even explore a potential future for a series that for so long felt like such a dead end. Indeed, the future of Metal Gear Solid feels like a very odd thing to envision, but were it to materialise, I think it's interesting to remember that mechanical fidelity alone does not a compelling Metal Gear make. As we've been able to see from analysing the boss rosters here, the most memorable games, the moments in this series that are truly etched into the hearts and minds of so many adoring fans, are the ones that can instead maintain the strongest relationship between gameplay and story, narrative giving much needed context to mechanics, and vice versa. For all that Metal Gear Solid has been derided over the years, even by those who enjoy the series, as one you watch rather than play, looking at the bosses specifically provides the keenest examples of how that just isn't true. Psycho Mantis forcing players to think outside the controller, Metal Gear Ray distorting your idea of how foes like this are meant to play out, the boss turning one of the game's defining mechanics into thematically dense, emotionally gut-wrenching catharsis. It's why I've actually been a little skeptical of Delta's emphasis on transposing 5's mechanics onto Snake Eater. The fidelity of those mechanics, if you want to call it that, is indeed polished to a mirror sheen, but those mechanics were also crafted for another game with its own story, and it says a lot that despite people often looking back on these games and decrying their perhaps off-standard control schemes as clunky, every one of those games has an incredibly distinct mechanical and systemic identity that I hope, in Delta's case, is preserved. You don't garner the longevity that Metal Gear Solid has maintained through pretty pretty cutscenes alone either. It's hard to think of a series that has given so much attention and care to its density of mechanics, where having your hands on a controller has been so crucial to its storytelling. But we also need time with these characters. They need time outside of the one point where their health bars are on the screen to form their own personalities separate from battle that end up lending such emotional weight to that eventual confrontation. Scenes that are often as bittersweet as they are exciting. If Metal Gear Solid was all Monster of the Week cartoon characters for you to methodically work your way through, there is not a chance people would remember these bosses so fondly. What we see unfurl at the series' best, then, is a cavalcade of convincingly, tragically broken individuals, all raging in their own ways against the systems of control that so thoroughly ground them down, from the moment they were born to the point at which they took up arms. As we can see, combat is often their only means of expression, of finding meaning in a world where every move they make seems to be part of some grand plan that they have no say in. In that sense, they often aren't so different from Snake. That is nuance. That's villainy you can nonetheless still care about, potentially relate to through mechanics. That's personality. As the series went on, and culminating with Metal Gear Solid 5, the team honed in on some of the best feeling stealth action mechanics in games, period. But as we can clearly see from looking at the bosses of these games throughout the decades, it ultimately means very little if the characters we go up against, for all their unhinged diatribes and ludicrous supernatural abilities, don't read to us as emotionally complicated people, if they lack humanity. Thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, all that daft YouTube stuff. It really helps the channel and it means the world. A massive thanks as well to my patrons, who you can see on screen and are all getting access to exclusive, fully produced videos that aren't available here. Your continued support is what allows me to keep going with the work I do on this channel, and I seriously cannot express how grateful I am for that. You are all the best. Special thanks go to Mark B. Writing, Artyom Vitsyuk, Michael Tritt, Alex O'Sullivan, Rickety Cricket, Cameron Siniseros, Don McLean, Urban Cheese, Charles J. Liu, Alistair Dunn, Vitautis Catharsis, Dolly Bowman, Young Condor, David Karstens, Tom Webster, Dana Sikauskis, Jordan Midler, Christopher Faherty, Nicholas Villeneuve, Yogesh Deshpande, Joe Lanzone, Leah Chinello, Captain Canusbrick, Dylan Robinson, Bryce Snyder, CPJ MLT Limited, David Björk, Nelwyn Palacios, Timothy Jones, Carl Christensen, Matthew Grover, Shardfire, Lynn Browning, Dallas Keane, and Charlie Yang. And with that, this has been another episode of Writing on Games. Thank you all so much for watching, stay safe, and I will see you all next time.